If you were to ask me, I would tell you that one of the favorite parts of ministry for me is doing this. I love to preach and to teach. But that's not the same thing as saying that I love to talk. You see, when I do this, I can prepare oh so carefully. I can disappear into my office for days at a time. I can read the text over and over and over again. I can consult commentary after commentary. I can write my notes, bounce my ideas off of others, and then emerge with a manuscript carefully prepared, practice over it, pray over it, and then, well, preach on a Sunday morning. But talking is far harder. If you're going to talk with people, you have to be quick on your toes. You have to have the gift of the gab. You have to be able to ask good questions and have interesting answers, and that's hard, to be able to talk smoothly about the weather and life and cows and crops and all of that. And so I often find myself in the midst of those conversations feeling like I'm riding a bike with one pedal. It's just somehow awkward. I am, despite the fact that I find myself up front so often, more introvert than extrovert, more shy than outgoing. And this was not helped by the fact that I grew up on a farm near a small town. So the 50 or so kids that entered the kindergarten class in Surrey Collegiate Institute in the fall of 1987 were more or less the same 50 kids that graduated in the spring of 2000. I met new people once in my life and then never had to do it again until, well, for some reason, I decided to go off to Germany after school, and there everything and everybody was new. And to tell you the truth, I didn't do too well. One of the first people I met was a Welshman named Phil. And somehow, maybe it was because we didn't have a lot of strange accents around Surrey, Manitoba growing up, or maybe it was just my jet-lag-addled brain, I was sure that this Welsh guy named Phil was a Frenchman named Philippe. He was deeply offended. And then I learned, when I began to meet some Germans, that people from different places, they actually have different sounding names than we have here. I grew up with like Justins and Jeffs and Julias. And it seemed that every girl at the school, her name began with a K. There were Katrins times two. There was two Carolines, and both went by the nickname Carlo. There was a Franz, which was helpful because I knew that name, but I didn't know how to pronounce it, and he too was bothered by the way that I said it. All this meeting new people, it was tough. But 2 weeks in, things were going well. I mean, I had the names down by that point, and I was getting to know people, and we were all getting along well. And the staff at the school, they emerged on a morning with a get well card. You see, it seemed that there was still one person missing from her class. She had been sick and unable to come. And they wanted us to write this card to encourage her, and told us that, you know, if things went well, that soon enough she would be at the school. And I don't know what I wrote on the card. I know I signed my name, but I know what I thought as well. And what I thought, truthfully, honest to goodness, was I hope she doesn't come. Because like meeting one more person at this point will be too much for me. And of course, she came. And this new girl quickly became friends with a troublemaker named Rahel. And from that moment on, nobody on the men's floor was safe. What I mean is, we woke up every morning to a surprise. Toothbrushes that had been soaked in some garlic concoction, double-sided tape on the toilet seats, plastic wrap over the toilet bowl, bouillon in the shower heads, lights gone, salt in our beds, onions in our pillowcases. It just never ended. And I promised revenge for all of these pranks, but truth be told, one of the pranksters had this amazing curly hair and sparkly eyes, and I would brush my teeth with that garlic toothbrush till the end of time, if it just gave me an opportunity to speak with her. And the first thing I wanted to find out was whether she spoke English or not, and she did, but only a little. And so we set to work learning each other's languages. We sat up in the evenings, and she learned 10 English words, and I learned 10 German words. Feuerlöscher, fire extinguisher. Geländer, handrail. After a while, I was learning the whole sentences. Ich könnte mich in deinen Augen verlieren. I could get lost in your eyes. Du bist der Stern in meiner Nudelsuppe. You're the star in my noodle soup. This went over really, really well. And we walked countless miles around the little German town that we were living in. And I bought her a $3 ring at a flea market, and eventually we got married. And here's the thing, we did not have a clue what we were getting into. I mean, it's been good, wonderful even, but we didn't have a clue. And I'm telling you that story this morning because we've arrived at the end of the book of Proverbs. At perhaps its most famous bit, Proverbs 31, the story of, well, a poem about this woman that the NRSV rather unimaginatively calls a capable wife. And I wonder what context you've met this famous Proverbs 31 woman in. Perhaps you've heard about her in a Mother's Day sermon. This is what we do year after year. Hey ladies, just be like this woman. Or maybe you've met her at a ladies' retreat or in a ladies' Bible study or in a book directed towards Christian wives. We have, I think most of us, met this Proverbs 31 woman. But it's strange when you think about it, that so often we meet this woman in material or sermons or curriculum that is geared towards women. And that's actually not the context of the book. I mean, this Proverbs 31 woman isn't held up for women saying, try to be like this. Because the book of Proverbs is actually, it's written towards men. So if you think back to the beginning, you know that it's a father addressing his son. You know that one of the major concerns in the opening chapters of the book is the father calling his son towards faithfulness. You know that many of the concerns, especially there at the beginning of the book, are about what it means to be a man entering into Israelite society. And so here at the end of the book as well, this is not counsel about what women are supposed to be. It's counsel about what these young men are supposed to be looking for. In fact, in the verses that lead into this famous poem, a mother counsels her son, don't waste your strength on women. And then the poem begins. A capable wife, who can find? In other words, you young men who have sat at the feet of the sages, this is what you should be looking for. So now we've set it up a little bit differently. Not women, be like this, but men, this is what you should be looking for. Let's read the poem, Proverbs 31, beginning in verse 10 and ending in verse 31. A capable wife, who can find? She is far more precious than jewels. The heart of her husband trusts her, and he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not harm all the days of her life. She seeks wool and flax and works with willing hands. She is like the ships of the merchant. She brings her food from far away. She rises while it is still night and provides food for her household and tasks for her servant girls. She considers a field and buys it. With the fruit of her hands, she plants a vineyard. She girds herself with strength and makes her arms strong. She perceives that her merchandise is profitable. Her lamp does not go out at night. She puts her hands to the distaff, and her hands hold the spindle. She opens her hand to the poor and reaches out her hands to the needy. She is not afraid for her husband when it snows. She's not afraid for her household when it snows. For all her household are clothed in crimson. She makes herself coverings. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. Her husband is known in the city gates, taking his seat among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them. She supplies the merchant with sashes. Strength and dignity are her clothing, and she laughs at the time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom, and the teaching of kindness is on her tongue. She looks well to the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her happy, her husband too, and he praises her. Many women have done excellently, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceitful, and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Give her a share in the fruit of her hands, and let her works praise her in the city gates. A few years ago, I had an opportunity to take a course called Ruth and Her Sisters about women in the Old Testament, as you might have guessed. And the very first week of that course was on this woman, a capable wife, in Proverbs 31. And the professor posed the same kind of question that I had posed to you earlier. What context have you heard this passage in? And before she allowed us as students to respond, she told two stories. The first was that she'd arrived in a new city to be teaching. She sat in a cab, and in the midst of small talk, it came out that she was teaching on women in the Old Testament. And this passage came up. Her cab driver was Jewish, and he said that for 39 years of marriage, every Friday night as the Sabbath began, he read this passage to his wife. It was a moment of celebration, week after week after week, that she was the center and foundation of their home. That's one way that we might encounter this passage. And then she told another story. This time she'd arrived in Uganda to teach on women in the Old Testament. And again, the topic of this passage came up. And she found that men who led ministries in Uganda were very familiar with this passage. And that often they used it to make their wives work like mules while they did little more than the man in the passage. Then, one of my classmates shared a story. She'd grown up in a home that was abusive. And this passage was one of the chains that bound her mother. If she could just be a little bit more like this capable wife, then maybe things would be fixed. But they never were. And eventually the marriage, the family fell apart. And yet this invisible chain, it still somehow bound the family because it was now the responsibility of a single mother and her daughters to support the dreams of the growing sons. The context that we hear this passage in, it makes a difference to how we interpret it, to how we read it, to how it shapes our lives. I've suggested to you already this morning that maybe the book invites us not to think about this passage as women, this is what you should be, but men, this is what you should be looking for. So men, not yet married, this is what you should be looking for. Here's the bad news, you will not find it. And here's one of the reasons that you will not find it. Because the Iron Age is over. It's done. You see, many of the skills that are celebrated in this passage, they were the skills and talents and abilities that were needed and celebrated in the world of 1,000 years ago and more. You see, women like this woman in Israel, they would have lived in a house that consisted of 4 rooms, the entire thing about 30 by 35 feet. 3 of those rooms were long, stretched just about the length of the house. And at the very back was one room that went across the width. They called it the broad room. Or sometimes in the Bible you encounter this room as the innermost parts of the house, the very, very back. That's where stuff was stored. One of the long rooms along the side was usually paved, and that's where a few animals would have been stabled in the winter, offering the heat of their bodies to help keep the house warm. The other 2 rooms were space for the activities of the house, for crafting and cooking and preparing. Sometimes the roof was flat and people would have slept on it. Sometimes there was a second floor. You get the idea. These homes would have been lived in by families that sometimes in their makeup looked much like our nuclear family. Mom, dad, and a couple of kids. Sometimes there would have been a senior couple along with their kids and married families. Sometimes, if the family could afford it, they would have built another similar house on the property. So you ended up with this complex of homes. People's lifespan were about half of what ours are. And unlike today, the lifespan of women, was shorter than that of men because, well, childbirth. Because of their short lives, parenthood was equal to adulthood. There was no such thing as an empty nester. By the time your kids were growing, you were probably dead. People ate mostly bread, about a pound of flour a day or a little bit more. A woman who was skilled at milling, and it was always a woman, worked with a long concave stone and a small convex one. And if she was good, she could turn out about a pound and 3/4 in an hour. 40 minutes every day just to mill the flour that people would eat. To mention a skill that's mentioned in the text, women often wove as well. It took over 130 hours just to spin enough yarn to make one wool garment, which might explain why a wool garment in Bible times cost about as much as a house. There was a lot of labor that went into it. Similarly, women wove rugs. And it would take 2 or 3 women a week to weave a simple rug. It's a lot of work and a lot of skill. Women didn't only do these things, they made the tools that they needed to do these things. So they built the ovens that they baked in, about 3 feet in diameter and probably about a foot high, this little clay dome. That was almost never in the house, but always outside so that the entire community had access to it. Because wood was scarce. And so if you shared an oven, then everybody had the job of looking for wood, and you also burned it more efficiently. These are the times and skills that are valued and celebrated in Proverbs 31. And so it's just different. That's all I'm saying. But that's an important point. Because often when we read this passage, rather than reading its picture of what it means to be a woman and a wife out of the text, we read what we want back into the text. A woman keeps a clean home and always has supper ready when her husband comes home. Or on the opposite side of things, this Proverbs 31 woman is a boss girl. We read what we want back into the text instead of reading something out of it. So maybe, though many of the skills that are mentioned here are the stuff of a bygone era, there's something more than just those skills of weaving and cooking and preparing. There's virtues here in this text as well. Stuff that I think is timeless, that belongs in the Iron Age as well as it belongs today. And that's where it gets interesting. I just forgot my notes. That wasn't done for dramatic intent. First off, I want you to notice that the New Revised Standards Version's translation in calling this woman a capable wife is flat. It is boring, and it gets it kind of wrong. She's not a capable wife. She's an Eshet Hayil. That word, Hayil, is tricky to translate. It's often that way with language, isn't it? Because languages aren't codes. Our words, they carry nuance and connotation that you often can't bring over into another language, and that's the way it is with being a woman of Hayil. See, that can mean wealthy, or strong, or noble. And it often has the connotation of being warlike with it. It carries with it this militaristic sense. And that idea that's there in Hayil at the beginning of the passage, it's woven throughout. So in verse 11, we're told that the husband enjoys every good thing that his wife brings home. And that good thing, the Hebrew word there is prey or plunder. Do you get it? This woman of Hayil goes out into the world and she brings home plunder. That warlike picture, it's there later in the passage as well. She girds her loins with strength. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to play one of the most coveted roles in Bethlehem Live. I got to be a bandit. Everybody wants to be a bandit. So we camped out, my bandits and I, behind this broken wooden fence. And we waited for the unsuspecting people to come walking through. And then we left the fence and went screaming, chasing after them, poking at them with our plastic daggers. And nobody was afraid. One of the reasons that they weren't afraid is because most of my fellow bandits were 8 years old and their knives were plastic. But the other reason is, it's so dang hard to run in a robe. You're always tripping over the hem. And so what Israelite warriors would have done is girded up their loins. They would have hoisted the thing up and tied it at their hips so that their legs were free to run. This is what you did when you went into battle or when you were preparing for any kind of physical labor. This Ashet Hayil, this woman of Hayil, this noble woman, she's so strong. This poem continues by saying that she makes her arms strong as well. This woman is no princess to be rescued. She's a warrior with strength. What else can we say about her? She knows how to work, doesn't she? I mean, from before the sun goes up in the morning until after it goes down in the evening. She's shrewd and smart, participating not just in the trade of the village, but in this network of trade that stretches out around the world. And she does it well. What else can we say about her? Not only does she enjoy the wealth that she has, but she uses it so generously. First of all, for her family, they are blessed by her. But also, towards her community, she is open-handed towards the poor. And just when you begin to think that this woman is too good to be true, she's probably an Instagram influencer whose life is really a mess on the other side of the camera, you realize that the people closest to her think the most highly of her. The people who know her the best are the loudest in singing her praises. This woman is remarkable. So guys, that's who you should be looking for. But here's the twist. And Andy Stanley has a remarkable way of putting the twist. He says that you need to become the kind of person you're looking for is looking for. Did you catch it? You need to become the kind of person you're looking for is looking for. Andy Stanley isn't drawing that out of Proverbs, he's drawing that out of life, but it's true of Proverbs as well. You see, all of these things that are put together in summary of this woman, they're not a surprise, because we've been reading them all the way through the book. This is what I needed my notes for. So this woman of Hayil, she's trustworthy. That's hardly a new idea. You see, Proverbs has emphasized this already. Proverbs 12:19. Truthful speech abides forever, a lying tongue, but for a moment. See, it's not just her that's supposed to be trustworthy, it's you too. Or Proverbs 12:22. Lying speech is an abomination to the Lord, but those who act faithfully please him. This woman of Hayil, she's got this incredible work ethic. Up before the sun and still working long after it goes down. And the picture of her work ethic is often her hands in the poem, isn't it? They're busy, weaving, preparing, working. We've seen these hands before in the book of Proverbs. Maybe Proverbs 10, verse 4. A slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. The woman's hands are not only diligent, they're also open towards the poor. This is one of Proverbs' favorite themes. Only a few verses earlier, Lemuel's mother has taught him to speak out for those who cannot speak for themselves. Or in Proverbs 28:27, whoever gives to the poor will lack nothing, but one who turns a blind eye will get many a curse. This woman of Hail, she's confident about the future. She laughs about it. Winter can get oh so cold, but her family will be dressed warmly. This too is the attitude of the wise earlier in Proverbs. Surely there is a future, and your hope will not be cut off. Proverbs 23:18. We could go on. Speaking words of kindness, Proverbs 15:7. Courage, Proverbs 24:5. Wealth and diligence, Proverbs 12:27. Time after time after time, we have seen the attributes of this woman before in what the young men who read the book are called to be. She is a fitting conclusion, a beautiful picture of all that we have already seen. And when we read it in the context of Proverbs, it ceases to be this burden that we place on the women in our communities. Be like this. And instead it becomes the call that all of us need to become the kind of people we're looking for are looking for. It's an invitation for all of us to pursue the virtues of wisdom. Courage, a work ethic, open-handed generosity to the poor. As we pursue wisdom, we become the kind of people that we want to be with. Let's pray.